On the night of May 12, 1945, at exactly 20 minutes past midnight, Rifleman Lachhiman Gurung crouched in a forward trench on the west bank of the Irrawaddy River, gripping his Lee Enfield rifle as Japanese grenades began landing from close range in the darkness around Taungdao village. At 24 years old, he was a Gurkha soldier with the 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, positioned 100 yards ahead of his company's main defensive line, the single most exposed post along a jungle path that 200 Japanese soldiers needed to capture if they wanted to escape Allied encirclement. His commanding officers had placed him there because the trench controlled the only route the enemy could use to break through and survive, and because Gurkhas had a reputation for holding impossible positions. When the first grenade landed on the lip of his trench, Gurung grabbed it and hurled it back into the jungle before it exploded. When the second grenade dropped inside the trench itself, he seized that one too and threw it back toward the enemy lines. But when the third grenade landed just in front of his position, he reached for it knowing he had maybe 4 seconds before detonation, and it blew up in his hand, shredding his right arm and destroying his fingers, leaving him wounded and bleeding in a trench with 2 badly injured comrades who could no longer fight. The Japanese assault had been designed around this exact moment: stun the defenders with grenades, then rush the position with overwhelming numbers before anyone could recover. 200 enemy soldiers formed up shoulder to shoulder in the darkness, preparing to charge a forward post now defended by 1 wounded rifleman with 1 working arm, betting that shock and mathematics would break the most important trench in the entire defensive line. What they had not calculated was that some men do not quit when the math says they should. Instead, Lachhiman Gurung picked up his rifle with his left hand and decided to prove that steady fire beats superior numbers every single time. The grenade detonated at exactly 23 minutes past midnight on May 13, 1945, turning Lachhiman Gurung's right hand into shattered bone and torn flesh in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The blast threw him backward against the rear wall of his trench, his Lee Enfield No. 4 Mark I rifle clattering against the mud walls as fragments of Japanese Type 97 fragmentation grenade tore through his right arm from wrist to elbow. Blood soaked into the dirt beneath him as he struggled to focus, through the ringing in his ears, the acrid smell of cordite mixing with the jungle humidity that had been pressing down on the Taungdao Valley all evening. His 2 section mates lay crumpled at the bottom of the trench, both badly wounded from the grenade storm that had begun without warning in the darkness, their groans barely audible over the sound of Japanese voices organizing in the jungle 20 yards away. Gurung pushed himself upright with his left hand and felt along his right arm, confirming what the pain had already told him. His fingers were gone, his hand was destroyed, and his forearm hung useless at his side, but his left arm still worked and his legs still held his weight. The Lee Enfield lay within reach, its 10-round magazine still loaded with Taunt 303 British cartridges, each one capable of dropping a man at 600 yards if the shooter could hold steady and squeeze the trigger at the right moment. He had been shooting since he was 14 years old in the hills of Nepal, first with his father's old Martini Henry, then with British rifles after he enlisted in 1939, and muscle memory did not care which hand pulled the trigger as long as the barrel pointed true. The Japanese voices grew louder as enemy soldiers moved through the undergrowth, their boots crushing dead leaves and then snapping branches in their hurry to reach the forward trench before the defenders could recover from the grenade attack. Lieutenant General Shozo Sakurai had trained his 28th Army to use this exact sequence during the long retreat from Arakan through the Irrawaddy Valley, overwhelm the target position with close-range grenades, then charge with superior numbers while the enemy was still stunned and bleeding. The tactic had worked against other Allied positions throughout the Burma campaign, breaking defensive lines and opening escape routes for Japanese forces trying to avoid encirclement and destruction. At Taungdao, Sakurai's men needed to capture this single forward trench because it controlled the jungle path that led directly into the rear of the Gurkha company's reverse slope position, and without that path, 200 Japanese soldiers would be trapped against the Irrawaddy with nowhere to retreat. Gurung lifted the rifle with his left hand, feeling the familiar weight of 9 pounds plus the additional 12 ounces of the scope and mount, and worked the bolt to chamber around. The movement sent fresh waves of pain through his shattered right arm, but the Lee Enfield's bolt-action mechanism operated smoothly despite being held at an unfamiliar angle. British ordnance had designed the rifle for reliability under combat conditions, with tolerances loose enough to function when clogged with mud, sand, or blood, and the weapon had proven itself in trenches from France to North Africa to the jungles of Burma. Each cartridge in the 10-round magazine contained 47 grains of cordite, propelling a 174-grain bullet at 2,440 feet per second, delivering enough kinetic energy to stop any attacking soldier within the rifle's effective range. The first Japanese soldiers appeared at the edge of the jungle 30 yards away, moving in a loose skirmish line with bayonets fixed to their Arisaka type, 99 rifles. They advanced cautiously at first, expecting return fire from multiple defenders. But when no shots came from the forward trench, they grew bolder and began to move faster toward the position. Their plan depended on speed and overwhelming numbers, with each wave of attackers designed to reach the trench before the wounded defenders could organize effective resistance. The assault force had been calculated to provide a 3-to-1 advantage in numbers, accounting for expected casualties during the final rush across open ground, and Japanese doctrine called for continuous pressure until the objective was captured, or the attack was definitively repulsed. Gurung steadied the rifle against the forward lip of the trench and acquired his first target through the iron sights, a Japanese soldier advancing directly toward his position with a grenade in his throwing hand. The range was 25 yards, close enough that even shooting left-handed with a wounded right arm would not affect accuracy significantly, and Gurung had learned during his years of training that patience was more valuable than speed when facing multiple attackers. He controlled his breathing, held the front sight steady on the center of the enemy soldier's chest, and squeezed the trigger with the deliberate pressure that had been drilled into him during countless hours on the rifle range at the regimental training depot in India. The Lee Enfield bucked against his shoulder as the cartridge fired, sending the 174-grain bullet across the intervening space in less than a tenth of a second. The Japanese soldier dropped immediately, his grenade falling harmlessly to the jungle floor as he collapsed backward into the undergrowth. Gurung worked the bolt with his left hand, ejecting the spent cartridge case and chambering the next round, then shifted his aim to the second enemy soldier, who was now charging directly at the trench with his bayonet extended. The range had closed to 15 yards, but Gurung held his fire until the attacking soldier reached 10 yards, then squeezed the trigger again and watched his target fall face first into the mud. The remaining Japanese soldiers realized that the forward trench was still defended and began to spread out, seeking cover behind trees and fallen logs while their officers organized the next assault wave. They had expected to find dead or unconscious defenders after the grenade attack, not a wounded Gurkha rifleman who could still shoot accurately enough to drop attackers at point-blank range. Their tactical problem had suddenly become more complex, requiring coordinated rushes from multiple directions to overwhelm a single defender who controlled the most advantageous position on the battlefield. The jungle path remained blocked, the escape route was still sealed, and 200 Japanese soldiers were running out of time before Allied reinforcements could arrive to complete their encirclement. Gurung reloaded his rifle with a fresh 10-round stripper clip, the brass cartridges sliding smoothly into the magazine, despite being handled with his offhand in complete darkness. His right arm hung useless at his side, blood still seeping from the grenade wounds, but his left arm was steady, and his eyes had adjusted to the jungle gloom well enough to distinguish movement among the trees. The 2 wounded Gurkhas at the bottom of his trench were unconscious but still breathing, depending on him to hold the position until relief could arrive from the main company defensive line 100 yards to the rear. If he abandoned the forward trench, the Japanese would capture the high ground and use it to attack the reverse slope position from behind, collapsing the entire defensive perimeter and allowing Sakurai's forces to escape toward the Taungup Road. The Japanese withdrawal toward Taungdao had begun 3 days earlier on May 9th, when Lieutenant General Shozo Sakurai realized that his 28th Army could no longer hold defensive positions along the Prom to Taungup Road without being completely destroyed by Allied forces advancing from multiple directions. British and Indian units had crossed the Irrawaddy River in force during April, establishing bridgeheads on the west bank and systematically reducing Japanese strongpoints throughout the region, while Allied air power made daylight movement nearly impossible for retreating enemy columns. Sakurai's strategic problem was simple but deadly. His army needed to escape toward the Arakan coast before Allied pincers could close around them, but every viable withdrawal route was being watched and blocked by Commonwealth forces who had studied Japanese retreat patterns throughout the Burma campaign. The 89th Indian Infantry Brigade had received orders on May 7th to cross the Irrawaddy and operate aggressively against enemy forces north of the Prom to Tongup Road, with specific instructions to prevent Japanese units from escaping toward prepared positions in the coastal mountains. Brigadier John Lyde, commanding the brigade, understood that his mission was not simply to fight retreating Japanese forces, but to destroy them before they could reorganize and continue resistance from more defensible terrain. The 4th Battalion, 8th Gurkha Rifles, under Lieutenant Colonel Walter Collier Walker, had been assigned the critical task of blocking the Tong Da Valley, which intelligence reports identified as the most likely escape route for enemy forces retreating from positions around Prom. Walker had positioned his battalion companies to cover the jungle paths leading through Tong Da village, with forward observation posts placed to provide early warning of Japanese movement toward the valley. The terrain favored defenders who could establish overlapping fields of fire from concealed positions, but it also provided multiple approach routes that attacking forces could use to infiltrate around or between defensive positions if they moved carefully during darkness. British doctrine called for forward posts to be placed far enough ahead of main defensive lines to detect enemy movement before it could threaten the primary position, but close enough to receive supporting fire if the observation posts came under direct attack. Gurung's trench had been sited 100 yards forward of the company's main defensive line, specifically to control the most direct jungle path into the battalion area, with clear fields of fire extending 30 to 50 yards in multiple directions depending on the density of vegetation. The position commanded high ground that overlooked the approach routes Japanese forces would need to use if they attempted to bypass or assault the main defensive perimeter, making it impossible for enemy units to advance undetected toward the reverse slope position where the bulk of the Gurkha company was dug in. Walker had selected Gurung for the forward post because experienced riflemen were more likely to make accurate target identification decisions under pressure, distinguishing between civilians, friendly forces, and legitimate military targets in the confusion of night combat. Japanese reconnaissance had identified the forward trench as the key terrain feature that needed to be captured before any successful assault on the main defensive position could begin. Sakurai's tactical officers had observed Allied defensive patterns throughout the Burma retreat and understood that Commonwealth forces typically placed their most experienced soldiers in critical observation posts, meaning that the lone rifleman in the advanced position would be difficult to dislodge through conventional infantry tactics. The decision to begin the assault with concentrated grenade attacks reflected Japanese understanding that shock and overwhelming firepower were necessary to neutralize skilled defenders who held advantageous positions with good fields of fire. The Type 97 hand grenades used in the initial attack weighed approximately 1 pound each when fully loaded with explosive charge and fragmentation sleeve, with a time delay mechanism that provided 4 to 5 seconds between activation and detonation. Japanese doctrine called for grenades to be thrown from ranges of 15 to 20 yards when possible, close enough to ensure accuracy, but far enough to protect the thrower from blast effects and return throws by alert defenders. Each grenade contained enough explosive power to kill or severely wound any personnel within a 5-yard radius of the detonation point, and fragments could cause casualties at ranges up to 15 yards, depending on terrain and protective cover available to potential targets. The timing of the assault had been calculated to take advantage of the period between midnight and dawn, when defending forces would be at their lowest state of alertness after hours of static observation duty. Japanese forces had moved into attack positions during the late evening hours of May 12th, approaching through jungle terrain that provided concealment from Allied observation posts while allowing assault units to concentrate near their assigned objectives. The plan called for simultaneous attacks on multiple defensive positions throughout the battalion area, with the forward trench receiving priority attention because its elimination would open the most direct approach route to the reverse slope position. Sakurai understood that his window of opportunity was rapidly closing as Allied reinforcements continued to arrive in the Irrawaddy Valley region, bringing additional artillery, air support, and fresh infantry units that could complete the encirclement of his retreating forces. Intelligence reports indicated that the 1st Battalion, 11th Sikh Regiment, was moving toward the Taungdao area as part of a broader Allied effort to seal off Japanese escape routes, meaning that any breakthrough attempt would need to succeed within the next 24 to 48 hours, or risk facing significantly stronger defensive positions. The 28th Army's survival depended on opening at least one viable withdrawal route before Commonwealth forces could establish an unbreakable cordon around the remaining Japanese units. The assault on Gurung's position represented more than a tactical engagement between individual soldiers. It was a critical test of whether disciplined defensive fire could overcome numerical superiority and tactical surprise under combat conditions that favored the attacking force. Japanese planners had allocated approximately 200 soldiers to the Taungdao breakthrough attempt, believing that this level of force concentration would be sufficient to overwhelm any Allied blocking positions and open the valley for the passage of larger units moving toward the coast. The success or failure of this single attack would determine whether thousands of Japanese soldiers could escape encirclement or would be forced to surrender or die in place as Allied forces completed their tactical encirclement. Walker's defensive plan depended on each forward post maintaining its position long enough for supporting forces to respond to enemy attacks, creating interlocking zones of fire that would channel Japanese assault forces into predetermined killing areas where concentrated defensive firepower could inflict maximum casualties. The system worked only if individual posts refused to abandon their positions when attacked, holding their assigned sectors even when facing overwhelming odds until relief forces could arrive or the enemy assault was definitively repulsed. Gurung's Trench had become the critical node in this defensive network, the single point where Japanese breakthrough attempts would either succeed or fail based on the actions of one wounded rifleman with limited ammunition and no prospect of immediate reinforcement. The second wave of Japanese attackers emerged from the jungle at 37 minutes past midnight, moving in a coordinated rush from 3 different directions while their comrades provided covering fire from concealed positions among the trees. Gurung tracked the movement through his iron sights, counting at least 15 soldiers advancing toward his trench in the initial assault wave, with more enemy personnel visible in the shadows behind them preparing for follow-up attacks. The Japanese had learned from their first unsuccessful rush and were now using proper infantry tactics, with lead elements drawing defensive fire while supporting troops maneuvered to flanking positions where they could attack the trench from multiple angles simultaneously. Gurung held his fire until the nearest Japanese soldier reached 12 yards, then squeezed the trigger and watched the man collapse backward into the undergrowth. He worked the Lee Enfield's bolt with practiced efficiency, ejecting the spent cartridge, case and chambering the next round in a single smooth motion that required less than 2 seconds to complete. The rifle's bolt action mechanism operated reliably despite being manipulated with his offhand, and the weapon's balance remained stable even when held at an unfamiliar angle due to his wounded right arm. He shifted his aim to the next closest target and fired again, dropping a second Japanese soldier at 10 yards range before the enemy assault wave could reach his position. The remaining attackers dove for cover behind fallen logs and jungle vegetation, shouting orders in Japanese while their officers reorganized them for another attempt. Gurung used the brief lull to reload his rifle, sliding a fresh 10-round stripper clip into the magazine and working the bolt to chamber the first cartridge. The brass cases gleamed dully in the moonlight as they clicked into place, each one containing enough propellant to drive a 174-grain bullet at over 2,000 feet per second with sufficient kinetic energy to stop any attacking soldier within the Lee Enfield's effective range. Enemy voices grew louder as Japanese squad leaders coordinated their next assault, and Gurung could hear boots moving through the jungle on both flanks of his position as enemy soldiers attempted to establish crossfire positions. The tactical situation was deteriorating rapidly. Instead of facing attackers from a single direction, he now had to defend against enemies approaching from 3 different angles while maintaining fields of fire that covered all possible approach routes. Japanese doctrine called for exactly this type of coordinated assault to overwhelm isolated defensive positions, using superior numbers and multiple approach routes to create situations where lone defenders could not engage all threats simultaneously. The third assault began at 43 minutes past midnight, with a barrage of Type 97 grenades thrown from ranges of 15 to 20 yards, forcing Gurung to take cover in the bottom of his trench while explosions bracketed his position. Fragments whined overhead, and dirt cascaded down the trench walls as the grenades detonated in rapid succession, each explosion designed to suppress defensive fire long enough for assault troops to close the remaining distance to hand-to-hand combat range. The bombardment lasted nearly 30 seconds, with at least 8 grenades exploding within a 20-yard radius of the forward trench, filling the air with smoke and debris that obscured visibility in all directions. Gurung emerged from cover as the grenade explosions ended and immediately engaged a Japanese soldier who had reached the lip of his trench during the bombardment. The range was less than 5 yards, close enough that he could see the enemy soldier's face clearly in the moonlight as he squeezed the trigger and watched the man fall backward, with his bayonet-tipped rifle clattering against the trench rim. 2. More Japanese soldiers appeared at the opposite end of the position, having used the grenade attack to advance undetected through the jungle, and Gurung worked the bolt and fired twice in rapid succession, dropping both attackers before they could employ their own weapons effectively. The intensity of enemy fire increased dramatically as Japanese machine gunners opened up from positions 30 to 40 yards away, sending streams of 6.5mm bullets crackling through the air just above the forward trench. The machine gun fire was intended to suppress Gurung's return fire while assault troops maneuvered closer, but the weapon's muzzle flashes also revealed enemy positions that had previously been concealed by jungle vegetation. Gurung noted the locations of at least 2 Type 96 light machine guns, based on their distinctive sound and rate of fire, information that would be valuable if he survived long enough to relay it to his company headquarters. Japanese assault troops used the covering fire to advance within grenade range again, and Gurung found himself facing another barrage of hand grenades thrown from multiple directions simultaneously. He pressed himself against the rear wall of the trench as explosions erupted all around his position, the concussions hammering his eardrums and filling his mouth with the taste of cordite and dirt. One grenade landed directly in the trench but failed to detonate, its time delay mechanism apparently damaged during the throw, and Gurung quickly grabbed the unexploded ordnance and hurled it back toward the enemy lines where it exploded harmlessly among the trees. The fourth assault wave consisted of at least 20 Japanese soldiers advancing in a coordinated rush from multiple directions, with some attackers providing suppressive fire while others closed to bayonet range. Gurung engaged targets in order of proximity and threat level, firing with deliberate precision rather than rapid volleys that would quickly exhaust his ammunition supply. Each shot was aimed carefully despite the chaos surrounding his position, and each trigger pull resulted in an enemy casualty as 174 grain bullets found their targets with lethal accuracy. The Lee Enfield's 10-round magazine allowed him to maintain continuous fire without frequent reloading breaks that would leave him vulnerable to rushes by surviving attackers. Enemy soldiers reached the trench rim from 2 different directions simultaneously, forcing Gurung to engage targets at point-blank range while working the rifle's bolt action mechanism as rapidly as possible. The first Japanese soldier appeared directly in front of his position with a bayonet extended, and Gurung shot him at a range of less than 3 yards, the muzzle blast scorching the enemy soldier's uniform as the bullet struck center mass. A second attacker emerged from the left side of the trench, swinging his rifle like a club, but Gurung had already worked the bolt and chambered a fresh round, firing again before the enemy soldier could complete his attack. The sustained combat was taking a physical toll on Gurung's remaining strength, with blood loss from his grenade wounds creating fatigue that slowed his movements and affected his shooting accuracy. His left arm ached from the unfamiliar stress of operating the rifle single-handed, and the continuous muzzle blasts had partially deafened him, making it difficult to locate enemy positions by sound alone. Despite these handicaps, he continued to fire with controlled precision, making every cartridge count while conserving ammunition for the additional assault waves that were certain to follow. Japanese officers could be heard shouting orders in the jungle as they prepared for another coordinated attack, their voices indicating frustration with the failure of previous assault waves to eliminate the lone defender. The original tactical plan had called for the forward trench to be captured within minutes of the initial grenade bombardment, But nearly an hour had passed without achieving this objective, and Japanese casualties were mounting with each unsuccessful rush against the position. Dawn broke over the Taungdao Valley at 5:47 on the morning of May 13th, revealing the full scope of the carnage that had accumulated around Gurung's forward trench during 4 hours and 27 minutes of continuous combat. Japanese bodies lay scattered throughout the jungle in a rough semicircle extending from 10 to 30 yards around the defensive position, their uniforms torn by rifle bullets and their weapons abandoned where they had fallen during the repeated assault waves. The morning light also illuminated the extent of Gurung's wounds, with his shattered right arm hanging useless at his side and blood soaked into the earth around his firing position. But his left hand still gripped the Lee Enfield rifle, and his eyes remained alert for signs of renewed enemy activity. The Japanese assault had finally ceased at approximately 4:30 in the morning when surviving enemy soldiers withdrew into the deeper jungle, carrying their wounded comrades and abandoning the attempt to capture the forward trench that had cost them so dearly throughout the night. Lieutenant Colonel Walker's subsequent casualty assessment would record 87 Japanese dead in the immediate area around the company position, with 31 enemy bodies counted directly in front of Gurung's section of the defensive line. These numbers represented more than 15% of the total assault force that had attacked the Taungdao blocking position, casualties severe enough to cripple any follow-up attempts to break through the Allied defensive perimeter. Gurung's ammunition supply had been reduced to fewer than 20 cartridges remaining in his personal allocation, with empty brass cases scattered around his trench, marking the locations where he had fired during the most intense periods of the engagement. Each expended cartridge represented a deliberate decision to engage a specific target at a calculated range, with his disciplined fire control ensuring that no rounds were wasted on uncertain targets, or suppressive fire that would not contribute directly to stopping the enemy assault. The Lee Enfield's reliability had proven decisive during the prolonged engagement, with the rifle functioning flawlessly despite being operated under combat conditions that would have disabled less robust weapons. Communications with the main company position had been severed early in the battle when Japanese infiltrators cut the telephone lines connecting forward observation posts to battalion headquarters, leaving Gurung isolated and unable to request artillery support or medical evacuation for his wounded section mates. The loss of communications was part of Lieutenant General Sakurai's overall tactical plan, designed to prevent isolated Allied positions from coordinating mutual support or calling for reinforcements during critical phases of the breakthrough attempt. Japanese doctrine emphasized the importance of isolating enemy strong points before attempting to reduce them through direct assault, recognizing that Commonwealth forces were most vulnerable when they could not coordinate supporting fires. The two wounded Gurkhas at the bottom of Gurung's trench had remained unconscious throughout most of the night battle, their injuries from the initial grenade barrage severe enough to prevent them from participating in the defense of their position. Their survival had depended entirely on Gurung's ability to prevent Japanese soldiers from overrunning the forward trench and completing the elimination of his section, making his individual stand a matter of life and death for the men under his protection. British Army doctrine recognized that wounded soldiers became a tactical liability in defensive positions, requiring able-bodied personnel to protect them rather than focus exclusively on engaging enemy forces. But Gurung had managed to fulfill both responsibilities simultaneously. Japanese tactical doctrine had called for the assault on the forward trench to succeed within the first hour of combat, allowing follow-up forces to exploit the breakthrough and attack the main defensive position from an advantageous direction before Allied reinforcements could respond. The failure to capture Gurung's position had disrupted this timeline completely, forcing Japanese commanders to commit additional assault waves against a target that should have fallen quickly, while Allied forces in the main defensive line prepared for extended combat. The tactical initiative had shifted decisively in favor of the defenders, with Japanese forces now trapped in exposed positions during daylight hours when Allied air power could be brought to bear against them. Enemy casualties had been inflicted through precise rifle fire, rather than area weapons or supporting artillery, demonstrating the effectiveness of disciplined marksmanship when applied under optimal conditions by experienced infantry soldiers. Each Japanese soldier killed or wounded around the forward trench had been engaged individually at ranges where the Lee Enfield's accuracy and stopping power could be employed to maximum advantage, with Gurung's shooting skills proving more decisive than superior enemy numbers or tactical coordination. The engagement validated British training doctrine that emphasized individual marksmanship as the foundation of infantry effectiveness, particularly in defensive situations where time and ammunition conservation were critical factors. The broader tactical situation remained precarious despite the successful defense of the forward trench, with Japanese forces still controlling multiple approach routes into the Taungdao Valley and additional enemy units potentially moving toward the area as part of Sakurai's overall withdrawal plan. Allied intelligence estimates suggested that the 28th Army still retained significant combat strength despite recent losses, and Japanese commanders had demonstrated their willingness to accept heavy casualties in order to maintain viable escape routes toward the Arakan coast. The defense of the forward position had prevented one breakthrough attempt, but additional attacks were likely as enemy forces became increasingly desperate to avoid complete encirclement. Lieutenant Colonel Walker's tactical assessment recognized that the successful defense of Gurung's position had saved the entire company defensive line from being compromised, but he also understood that his battalion remained isolated and vulnerable to renewed enemy attacks from multiple directions. Japanese forces had demonstrated their ability to coordinate complex night assaults involving hundreds of personnel, and their failure at the forward trench would likely result in modified tactics, designed to overcome the defensive advantages that had proven so costly during the initial engagement. The next 24 to 48 hours would determine whether the battalion could maintain its blocking position long enough for Allied reinforcements to arrive and complete the encirclement of retreating Japanese forces. Medical evacuation for Gurung and his wounded section mates remained impossible due to the tactical situation, with Japanese forces still controlling the approaches to the forward trench and sniper activity continuing throughout the daylight hours of May 13th. His wounds required immediate professional treatment to prevent infection and permanent disability, but military priorities demanded that the forward position continue to be manned as long as enemy forces remained in the immediate area. The decision to evacuate wounded personnel versus maintaining defensive strength represented one of the most difficult choices facing combat commanders, particularly when individual soldiers had demonstrated exceptional value in their assigned positions. The defense of the forward trench had lasted from 20 minutes past midnight until approximately 4:30 in the morning, representing 4 hours and 10 minutes of continuous combat against numerically superior enemy forces operating under advantageous conditions. This duration exceeded standard expectations for isolated defensive positions facing sustained assault, with most tactical manuals assuming that lone posts would be overrun within 1 to 2 hours when attacked by determined enemy forces with adequate numerical superiority. Relief arrived at the Taungdao defensive perimeter on the afternoon of May 15th, when elements of the 1st Battalion, 11th Sikh Regiment, fought their way through the remaining Japanese positions and established contact with Lieutenant Colonel Walker's isolated companies. The Sikh Regiment had been advancing toward the valley since May 13th, engaging scattered enemy forces and clearing roadblocks while Japanese commanders completed their withdrawal toward alternative escape routes that bypassed the now impregnable blocking position. Gurung was finally evacuated from his forward trench on May 16th after spending 3 days and 2 nights defending the position that had cost the Japanese 28th Army its primary breakthrough opportunity and forced Lieutenant General Sakurai to abandon his planned withdrawal through the Taungdao corridor. The medical assessment of Gurung's wounds confirmed that his right hand had been destroyed beyond surgical repair, with multiple fractures in his forearm and extensive soft tissue damage that would result in permanent disability and chronic pain throughout his remaining life. British Army medical officers noted that his survival was remarkable given the severity of his injuries and the duration of combat he had endured without proper treatment, but they also recognized that immediate evacuation on the night of May 13th would have been impossible due to the tactical situation surrounding his isolated position. The delay in medical treatment had allowed infection to develop in his wounds, complicating the healing process and increasing the likelihood of long-term complications that would affect his quality of life for decades to come. Lieutenant Colonel Walker completed his recommendation for Gurung's Victoria Cross on May 19, 1945, 6 days after the action at Taungdao and 3 days after his wounded riflemen had finally been evacuated to proper medical facilities. The recommendation process required detailed documentation of the tactical situation, enemy strength estimates, duration of combat, and specific actions that warranted recognition at the highest level of military honors. Walker's written assessment emphasized that Gurung's individual stand had prevented the collapse of the entire company defensive position and saved the lives of his wounded section mates, while inflicting casualties on the enemy that were far out of proportion to the forces engaged in the action. The official paperwork moved through military channels with unusual speed, reflecting the recognition among senior commanders that exceptional gallantry deserved prompt acknowledgement before the end of hostilities in the Burma theater. British Army administrative procedures typically required months of review and verification before Victoria Cross recommendations reached final approval, but the clear documentation of Gurung's actions and the testimony of surviving witnesses accelerated the process significantly. The recommendation was endorsed by brigade and divisional commanders who understood that individual acts of extraordinary courage provided morale benefits that extended far beyond their immediate tactical impact. The London Gazette published the official announcement of Gurung's Victoria Cross in its supplement dated July 27, 1945, providing the permanent historical record of his gallantry that would serve as the definitive account of the Taung Da action for military historians and subsequent generations. The citation language followed standard formulas established for Victoria Cross awards, emphasizing the tactical significance of his actions while avoiding dramatic embellishments that might undermine the credibility of the official record. The Gazette text noted that he had showed the utmost gallantry in the face of almost overwhelming odds and had saved the situation for his company through his refusal to abandon his position despite severe wounds. Preparation for the investiture ceremony began in November 1945 as British authorities in India organized formal recognition events for Victoria Cross recipients from the Burma campaign. The ceremony was scheduled for December 19th at the Red Fort in Delhi, a location chosen for its historical significance and its capacity to accommodate the senior military and civilian officials who would attend the proceedings. Multiple sources document the date and location of the investiture, but historical accounts differ regarding which high-ranking official actually presented the medal to Gurung, with some records crediting Viceroy Field Marshal Archibald Wavell and others identifying Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten as the presenter. The Victoria Cross itself represented more than individual recognition. It symbolized the broader contribution of Commonwealth forces to the Allied victory in Burma and the specific role of Gurkha units in some of the campaign's most difficult fighting. The medal's design and symbolism connected Gurung's individual gallantry to the larger narrative of sacrifice and determination that characterized the Burma War, while its presentation in Delhi emphasized the international character of the Allied effort in Southeast Asia. The ceremony provided an opportunity for senior officials to acknowledge publicly the debt owed to soldiers who had fought in conditions of exceptional hardship against a determined and skillful enemy. Gurung's post-war life reflected the challenges faced by many disabled veterans who had sacrificed their physical capabilities in service to their country, but struggled to find meaningful employment and adequate support in civilian society. His permanent disabilities prevented him from returning to the physically demanding occupations available to most Gurkha veterans, while his lack of formal education limited his options in clerical or administrative work that might have accommodated his physical limitations. The Victoria Cross provided a modest pension and considerable social recognition, but it could not restore the health and capabilities he had lost during 4 hours of combat at Taung Da. The broader significance of his individual stand became clearer as military historians analyzed the Burma campaign and identified key moments when small unit actions had influenced larger strategic outcomes. The successful defense of the forward trench had prevented Japanese forces from executing their planned withdrawal through the Taung Da Valley, forcing them to attempt alternative escape routes that exposed them to additional Allied attacks and ultimately contributed to the destruction of significant portions of the 28th Army. Individual gallantry had translated into strategic advantage, demonstrating the continuing importance of personal courage and tactical skill even in an increasingly mechanized and technological form of warfare. Gurung eventually emigrated to the United Kingdom, where he lived quietly for many years before his death in London in 2010 at the age of 89. His longevity was remarkable given the severity of his wartime injuries and the limited medical treatment available to disabled veterans in the immediate post-war period, but it also provided him with the opportunity to see his actions at Taungdao recognized by historians and military institutions as an exemplar of individual courage under impossible circumstances. His Victoria Cross remained one of only 13 awarded to members of Gurkha regiments during the Second World War, reflecting both the exceptional nature of his gallantry and the high standards applied to recommendations for the Commonwealth's highest military honor. The tactical lessons from the Taungdao action continued to influence British Army training doctrine for decades after the war, with Gurung's defense of his isolated position cited as an example of how disciplined marksmanship and tactical patience could overcome numerical disadvantage under optimal defensive conditions. Military training establishments used his actions to illustrate the importance of individual initiative and the decisive impact that single soldiers could have on larger tactical situations when they refused to abandon their responsibilities despite overwhelming odds and severe personal cost.